The drop pod screamed through Keithmore Prime's toxic atmosphere like falling meteors. Zixthai gripped the restraint harnesses with all 4 arms as the pod shook violently around him. Across from him, Captain Morrison sat calmly with his eyes closed, looking almost peaceful despite the chaos. The other humans showed the same strange composure, as if plummeting toward a world full of deadly enemies was nothing more than a routine transport flight. The impact knocked the breath from Zixthai's lungs even with his reinforced physiology. His pod had landed in what appeared to be a dried riverbed, surrounded by jagged rocks and twisted metal structures. The air outside glowed with a sickly green tint, and he could smell the sharp chemical tang of acid rain even through his sealed armor systems. Sound off. Morrison's voice crackled through the communication system as the humans emerged from their nearby pods. One by one, his squad members reported their status. All 5 humans had survived the drop without injury, their fragile bodies somehow intact despite the brutal landing. Zixthai activated his tactical display and immediately saw the first signs of trouble. Red markers appeared across the battlefield as enemy forces began moving toward their position. The intelligence estimates had been completely wrong. Instead of 50,000 Keithmori defenders, his scanners were picking up nearly twice that number. Worse, they were organized and moving with purpose, not the chaotic response typical of a surprised enemy. "We've got company," Sergeant Hayes announced, her voice steady despite the grim news her equipment was showing. "Multiple contacts approaching from 3 directions. Estimate 200 hostiles in the first wave. 200 Keithmori warriors against a handful of coalition soldiers." In his 3 decades of military service, Zixthai had never faced odds quite this desperate. Each Keithmori stood 8 feet tall with natural armor that could deflect most. Small arms fire. Their claws could slice through steel, and their acid spit could melt through combat armor in seconds. The first enemy fighters appeared on the ridge above them, moving with the terrifying speed that made the Keithmori such feared opponents. They dropped down the rocky slopes like giant spiders, their multiple eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. Zixthai raised his plasma rifle and began firing, his shots precise and deadly. Each blast found its mark, dropping one of the advancing creatures. Beside him, the humans had spread out into what appeared to be a standard defensive formation. But something seemed different about their movements now. The casual, almost playful attitude they had shown on the ship was completely gone. Morrison's blue eyes had turned cold and calculating as he methodically picked targets and fired. His shots were less accurate than Zixthai's, but he compensated by firing in controlled bursts that kept multiple enemies pinned down. The battle quickly turned into a nightmare. Wave after wave of Keithmori poured over the ridge, their inhuman shrieks echoing across the toxic landscape. Zixthai found himself falling back step by step, his ammunition running low despite his careful shot placement. This was exactly the kind of hopeless situation where lesser species would break and run. But the humans weren't running. Private Walsh had somehow found cover behind a fallen metal beam and was systematically destroying advancing enemies with his explosives. Instead of throwing grenades randomly, he was calculating angles and timing each blast for maximum effect. When his supply of conventional weapons ran out, he began improvising explosive devices from their equipment packs and debris from the battlefield. Medic Stone was treating wounded coalition soldiers while simultaneously firing at approaching enemies. Zixthai watched in amazement as she performed field surgery on a wounded Drachnian warrior, her hands steady and sure even as acid spit sizzled past her head. When a Keithmori warrior got too close to her patient, she drew a simple combat knife and buried it in the creature's throat with one smooth motion. Corporal Carter had taken position on higher ground and was providing covering fire with mechanical precision. His shots weren't as individually powerful as Zixthai's plasma blasts, but he never seemed to miss. More importantly, he was calling out enemy positions and coordinating the defense in a calm, professional voice that never wavered. Despite the chaos around him, Sergeant Hayes was doing something that made no sense to Zixthai. Instead of focusing purely on combat, she was actively scanning the battlefield and marking targets for orbital strikes. When a particularly large group of Keithmori gathered near a rock formation, she calmly called down devastating fire from the ships in orbit, completely eliminating 30 enemies in a single blast. But it was Captain Morrison who truly caught Zixthai's attention. The human leader had moved forward, instead of back, getting closer to the enemy, rather than seeking safety. He was using the terrain like a weapon, luring groups of Keithmori into narrow passages where their numbers couldn't help them, then eliminating them with precise grenade placement. Hours passed in constant fighting. Coalition reinforcements should have arrived by now, but Zixthai's communication attempts were met only with static. They were alone on this toxic world, cut off from support and facing overwhelming odds. This was the kind of situation where even veteran Veltar warriors might consider an honorable retreat. The humans showed no signs of retreat. As the day wore on, Zixthai began to notice changes in the human squad that disturbed him on a fundamental level. They were adapting to the battlefield in ways he had never seen before. Morrison had somehow acquired a Keithmori acid thrower and was using it against its former owners. Walsh was building increasingly sophisticated traps using nothing but salvaged equipment and his own ingenuity. Stone was performing medical procedures. That should have been impossible under combat conditions, keeping wounded coalition soldiers fighting when they should have been evacuated. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. Not enjoying the killing exactly, but there was something in their movements and voices that suggested they were finding satisfaction in overcoming the impossible odds. They communicated with quick, efficient phrases that showed they understood each other perfectly. They moved like parts of a single organism, each member anticipating what the others would do. As night fell on Keithmore Prime, the tide of battle had somehow shifted. The endless waves of Keithmori attackers were becoming smaller and less coordinated. Bodies of the enemy fighters littered the battlefield in growing piles, and the survivors seemed to be pulling back to reassess the situation. Zixthai found himself standing in the middle of a defensive perimeter that should have been overrun hours ago. Around him, the 5 humans were calmly reloading weapons, sharing ammunition, and treating minor injuries as if they had just finished a training exercise rather than fighting for their lives against impossible odds. "Status report," Morrison said quietly, and his squad members responded with crisp efficiency. Minimal ammunition remaining. Several minor injuries, but everyone still combat effective. Enemy forces regrouping but showing signs of confusion and reduced morale. Zixthai stared at these small, supposedly fragile beings and felt something he had never experienced before in 3 decades of warfare. It wasn't fear of the enemy that gripped him now. It was the growing realization that he might not understand what humans really were beneath their soft exterior. They had faced extinction-level odds and responded not with panic or despair, but with methodical problem-solving and an almost casual refusal to accept defeat. As he watched Captain Morrison calmly planning their next move, Zixthai began to suspect that his first impression of humans might have been dangerously wrong. These weren't soft, weak beings who needed protection from the harsh realities of war. They were something else entirely. Something that became more dangerous when the situation became more desperate. The real question was what they would do next, and whether Zixthai was prepared for the answer. Commander Zixthai stood 7 feet tall in the briefing room of the Nexus Prime, his natural armor plates gleaming under the bright lights. His 4 arms moved with practiced grace as he reviewed the mission files on his datapad. The Veltar had been warriors for over 3,000 years, and Zixthai carried that proud tradition in every movement of his powerful frame. His people were known across the galaxy as the finest soldiers the Coalition had ever seen. When other species needed protection, they called the Veltar. When they needed a war won quickly and efficiently, they sent warriors like him. Today marked his first assignment working with humans, and he felt curious about these strange new allies. The Coalition had recently welcomed Earth into their ranks, though Zixthai wondered what use such small and fragile beings could possibly serve in real combat. He had seen the files. Humans averaged only 6 feet in height, had no natural armor, no enhanced strength, no special abilities that made them stand out among the hundreds of species in the galaxy. They seemed soft and weak, with thin skin that could be cut by the simplest blade. The briefing room doors opened with a soft hiss, and 5 humans walked inside. Zixthai studied them carefully, trying to understand why the coalition had bothered to recruit such ordinary-looking creatures. The leader stepped forward first, a man with brown hair and calm blue eyes who looked to be in his 30s. His uniform bore the rank insignia of a captain, though he seemed far too young and small to command anything important. "Commander Zixthai, I'm Captain Jake Morrison," the human said, extending his right hand in what Zixthai had learned was a human greeting gesture. The Veltar warrior reached down with one of his 4 arms and carefully shook the offered hand, amazed at how delicate the human's grip felt. Morrison's hand was soft and warm, nothing like the hardened claws of a proper warrior. "These are my squad members," Morrison continued, gesturing to the others. "Sergeant Lisa Hayes, our communications specialist." A woman with short blonde hair nodded politely. She looked even smaller than Morrison, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with bright green eyes and a friendly smile that seemed completely out of place on a military vessel. "Corporal Ben Carter, our weapons expert," Morrison said, indicating a dark-skinned man who carried himself with quiet confidence. Carter gave a brief salute, his movements precise but lacking the natural deadly grace that marked a true warrior. "Private Danny Walsh, Explosives and Engineering," Morrison said, pointing to a young man with red hair who looked barely old enough to be away from his home world. Walsh grinned widely and gave a casual wave, his behavior far too relaxed for someone about to enter combat, and Medic Amy Stone, our field surgeon. The last human was a woman with long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a large medical bag and had the calm, steady look of someone used to dealing with injuries and death. Zixthai looked at this collection of soft, small humans and felt a mixture of confusion and concern. In his culture, warriors were chosen for their size, strength, and natural fighting abilities. These humans possessed none of those qualities. They looked like they would break if he accidentally bumped into them too hard. "It is an honor to work with the legendary Veltar," Morrison said respectfully. "We've heard great things about your people's military achievements." "Thank you, Captain," Zixthai replied, his voice deep and resonant. "Though I must admit I am curious about your role in this mission. What exactly do humans contribute to combat operations?" Morrison smiled, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his blue eyes that Zixthai couldn't identify. "I guess you'll find out soon enough, Commander." The main briefing began as holographic displays filled the center of the room. Admiral Korth, a massive Zerlian with thick purple skin and 6 eyes, activated the tactical projections. The image showed a dark world covered in twisted spires and acidic clouds. "This is Keithmore Prime," the Admiral announced in his booming voice. "Home world of the Keithmori slave empire. For the past 50 years, they have been capturing entire populations from peaceful worlds and forcing them into labor camps. Intelligence estimates they currently hold over 2 million beings from 40 different species." Zixthai studied the tactical data with professional interest. The Keithmori were known throughout the galaxy as vicious fighters. Each warrior stood 8 feet tall, with natural exoskeleton armor, razor-sharp claws, and the ability to spit concentrated acid. They built their cities like hives with thousands of tunnels and chambers that made assault nearly impossible. "Our mission is to infiltrate their primary hive complex and destroy their central control systems," Admiral Korth continued. "This will free the slaves and cripple their ability to capture more victims. Intelligence suggests approximately 50,000 Keithmori defenders are stationed on the planet, 50,000 enemy fighters." Zixthai had faced those kinds of odds before, but always with other Veltar warriors beside him. He glanced at the humans again, wondering how they planned to contribute to such a dangerous mission. Morrison was taking notes on a simple paper pad, while his squad members studied the holographic displays with quiet concentration. "The assault force will consist of 300 coalition soldiers," the Admiral announced. "Veltar shock troops will handle the primary assault, supported by Drachnian heavy weapons specialists and Zentari stealth units. The human squad will serve in a support capacity." Support capacity. That made sense to Zixthai. Humans could probably handle logistics, or communication duties while the real warriors did the fighting. He felt relieved that the coalition wasn't planning to send these fragile beings into direct combat against the Keithmore. After the briefing ended, Zixthai approached Morrison as the other species filed out of the room. "Captain, I hope you will not take offense, but I am concerned about your squad's safety during this operation. The Keithmore are extremely dangerous opponents." Morrison looked up at the towering Veltar warrior and smiled again. That same strange flicker appeared in his eyes, lasting just a moment longer this time. "That's very considerate of you, Commander. We appreciate the concern. Perhaps it would be better if your people remained on the ship during the assault," Zixthai suggested carefully. "You could coordinate communications from a safe distance." Morrison's smile grew wider and he exchanged glances with Sergeant Hayes, who had been listening nearby. Both humans seemed to find something amusing in Zixthai's suggestion. "Don't worry about us, Commander," Morrison said softly. "We'll do our part when the time comes." As the humans left the briefing room, Zixthai watched them go with growing puzzlement. There was something about their quiet confidence that didn't match their apparent physical limitations. He had expected them to show fear or at least concern about facing the Keithmore, but instead they seemed almost eager for the mission to begin. Later that evening, as the Nexus Prime prepared for the jump to Keithmore Prime, Zixthai found himself wondering what exactly he would discover about these strange new allies when the fighting started. The tunnel system beneath Keithmore Prime stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of carved passages that seemed designed to confuse and trap invaders. Zixthai moved carefully through the narrow corridors, his forearms ready with weapons, as he followed Captain Morrison deeper into the enemy stronghold. Somewhere above them, the rest of the coalition forces were still fighting on the surface, but down here in the darkness, only 6 beings remained alive from their original squad. 72 hours had passed since the initial assault began. 72 hours without sleep, without proper food, without reinforcements or support from the fleet above. The communication jamming was so complete that they couldn't even confirm whether the other coalition forces were still alive. For all they knew, they were the only survivors of the entire operation. Zixthai had fought in many desperate situations during his long military career, but this felt different. The Keithmore weren't just defending their territory. They were hunting the invaders through their own tunnel network with methodical precision. Every passage could hide an ambush. Every sound could signal an approaching swarm of enemy warriors. The psychological pressure was enormous, designed to break the will of even experienced soldiers, but the humans seemed to be thriving. Captain Morrison led them through the tunnels with quiet confidence, making navigation decisions that somehow always proved correct. He had stopped consulting his tactical displays hours ago, instead relying on instincts that Zixthai couldn't understand. The humans seemed to sense which passages would be safe and which ones contained traps or enemy forces waiting in ambush. Behind him, the rest of the human squad moved like ghosts. Their earlier casual friendliness had been replaced by something cold and focused. They communicated with hand signals and brief whispers, their movements coordinated with an efficiency that impressed even a veteran Veltar warrior. Private Walsh had become particularly unsettling to watch. The young human with red hair was setting traps throughout the tunnel system using materials that shouldn't have been able to create effective weapons. Medical supplies from Amy Stone's field kit, broken pieces of Keithmore equipment, even rocks and debris from the tunnel walls, all somehow transformed into deadly surprises for pursuing enemies. Zixthai had seen Walsh take apart a damaged communication device and combine its components with water purification tablets to create an explosive that could collapse tunnel sections. The human worked with a focused intensity that never wavered, even when enemy acid spit was sizzling on the walls around him. Medic Stone continued to amaze and disturb Zixthai in equal measure. She had been wounded during a firefight 12 hours ago, taking a Keithmore claw strike across her left shoulder that should have disabled her completely. Instead, she had calmly treated her own injury while continuing to provide covering fire, then resumed her duties as if nothing had happened. Now she moved through the tunnels with her medical bag slung across her injured shoulder, ready to treat wounded allies or enemies with the same clinical detachment. Corporal Carter had stopped speaking entirely, except when absolutely necessary, for tactical communication. He moved through the dark passages with mechanical precision, his weapon always ready, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. When enemies appeared, he eliminated them with swift efficiency, then resumed his silent watch without comment or celebration. Sergeant Hayes had perhaps changed the most dramatically of all. The friendly woman with blonde hair and green eyes who had smiled politely during their first meeting had become something resembling a hunting predator. She anticipated enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, set up ambushes that decimated pursuing Keithmore forces, and adapted to new tactical situations faster than Zixthai's enhanced combat reflexes could follow. But it was Morrison himself who truly disturbed the Veltar warrior. The human captain had been awake for over 60 hours straight, had suffered multiple injuries that should have slowed him down, and was operating in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced soldiers. Instead of showing signs of fatigue or stress, he seemed to become more focused and effective with each passing hour. During their latest engagement with a Keithmore patrol, Zixthai had watched Morrison make a tactical decision that defied all military logic. Faced with superior numbers in an unfavorable position, the human had ordered his squad to advance directly toward the enemy rather than seeking cover or attempting to withdraw. The maneuver should have resulted in their complete destruction. Instead, the unexpected aggression had confused the Keithmore long enough for the humans to close distance and engage in brutal close-quarters combat. Morrison himself had killed 3 enemy warriors using nothing but a combat knife and what appeared to be pure determination. His movements were no longer those of a trained soldier following doctrine, but something more primal and deadly. The tunnel they were currently following opened into a larger chamber, and Zixthai immediately sensed danger. His combat instincts, honed through decades of warfare, screamed warnings about the space ahead. The chamber was too quiet, too empty, too perfectly positioned for an ambush. Morrison raised his hand to signal a halt, then gestured for the squad to spread out along the chamber walls. His tactical assessment matched Zixthai's perfectly, but his response was characteristically human in its directness. "They're waiting for us," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "How many?" Hayes asked, her own voice, carrying a note of anticipation rather than concern. "Does it matter?" Carter replied, speaking for the first time in hours. The Keithmore attack came from multiple directions at once, just as expected, but instead of the coordinated defensive response that Zixthai anticipated, the humans did something that made his warrior's soul recoil in shock. They split up and attacked in different directions, each one engaging multiple enemies simultaneously, rather than supporting each other as tactical doctrine demanded. Walsh disappeared into a side passage, pursuing a group of enemy fighters with a collection of improvised explosives. Stone moved toward the chamber's center, drawing enemy fire while simultaneously treating a wounded coalition soldier they had discovered chained to the wall. Carter took high ground on a natural ledge and began systematically eliminating enemies with precision shots. Hayes vanished into the shadows and began appearing behind enemy positions like a phantom, striking with deadly efficiency before disappearing again. And Morrison walked directly into the center of the enemy formation, moving with calm confidence as he engaged multiple Keithmore warriors at once. Zixthai found himself fighting alongside beings who seemed to have abandoned all concept of self-preservation in favor of objective completion. They took risks that should have been suicidal, made tactical decisions that violated every principle of military science, and somehow succeeded through sheer determination and adaptability. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to the veteran Veltar warrior. When the last Keithmore fell, the chamber was filled with the bodies of over 30 enemy fighters. 6 beings had engaged and defeated a force that should have required at least 20 experienced soldiers to overcome. As they prepared to continue deeper into the tunnel system, Zixthai looked at his human companions and realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare was being proven wrong. These small, fragile beings had somehow turned their apparent weaknesses into devastating advantages. Their lack of natural armor meant they could move faster and fit into spaces that larger warriors couldn't access. Their emotional attachments to each other created coordination and mutual support that exceeded anything in his experience. Their refusal to accept logical defeat meant they continued fighting in situations where other species would surrender. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to become more effective as the situation became more desperate. The worse their odds, the more creative and deadly they became. It was as if humans had evolved specifically to thrive in circumstances that would destroy other species. As they moved deeper into the Keithmore stronghold, Zixthai began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. These weren't just soldiers completing a mission. They were predators who had finally found prey worthy of their attention. And he was beginning to fear what they might do when they reached their objective. The primary hive complex rose before them like a nightmare cathedral carved from living rock and metal. Massive organic towers twisted toward the poisonous sky, connected by bridges that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. Somewhere inside this fortress lay the central control systems that coordinated the entire Keithmore slave operation across dozens of worlds. Zixthai crouched behind a ridge of crystallized acid deposits, studying the target through his tactical scope. 4 days had passed since their insertion, and the mission had become something far beyond its original parameters. Of the 300 coalition soldiers who had begun this assault, fewer than 60 remained alive. The humans beside him represented the only intact squad left from the entire operation. But they were no longer the same beings he had met aboard the Nexus Prime. Captain Morrison lay flat against the rocky ground, his uniform torn and stained with substances that Zixthai preferred not to identify. The human's blue eyes had taken on an intensity that made the Veltar warrior uncomfortable to meet directly. Morrison studied the hive complex with the focused attention of a predator selecting its prey, noting defensive positions and patrol patterns with mechanical precision. "Guard towers here, and here," Morrison whispered, indicating positions on his tactical display. Estimated 40 defenders on the outer perimeter, heavy weapons positions on the main approaches, biosensors throughout the lower levels. His analysis was flawless, matching everything that Zixthai's enhanced senses and military experience could detect. But there was something in Morrison's voice that suggested he was already planning to overcome obstacles that should have been impossible for such a small force to handle. Sergeant Hayes materialized beside them like a ghost emerging from shadow. Her friendly smile and polite demeanor had vanished completely, replaced by something cold and efficient that reminded Zixthai more of a hunting machine than a living being. She carried equipment taken from dead Keithmore warriors, adapted and modified in ways that shouldn't have been possible with field resources. "Patrol schedules confirmed," she reported quietly. "They're rotating guards every 2 hours, next shift change in 47 minutes. I've identified 3 entry points that bypass their main sensor networks." Zixthai stared at her in amazement. Hayes had somehow infiltrated the outer defenses of the most secure facility on the planet, gathered detailed intelligence, and returned without being detected. The mission would have been challenging for a full reconnaissance team, but she had accomplished it alone while wounded and exhausted. Private Walsh appeared from another direction, his red hair now darkened with grime, and his young face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction. He carried a collection of improvised devices that looked like nothing Zixthai had ever seen before, but he had learned not to underestimate the human's creative destruction capabilities. "Structural analysis complete," Walsh reported with disturbing enthusiasm. "The main support columns are vulnerable here and here. If we can place charges at these points, we can bring down the entire eastern section and create a diversion while the others move on the primary objective." Corporal Carter emerged from his overwatch position, moving with the silent efficiency that had become his trademark. The dark-skinned human had stopped speaking unnecessary words days ago, communicating only essential tactical information in brief, precise phrases. His weapon had been modified with components taken from defeated enemies, creating something that was no longer quite human or Keithmore technology. Medic Stone was the last to join their impromptu planning session, and her transformation was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The woman who had carried medical supplies and treated wounded soldiers with gentle care had become something resembling a battlefield surgeon crossed with a combat engineer. She had been treating not only their own injuries but also interrogating captured enemies with clinical detachment that chilled Zixtai's warrior soul. Intelligence gathered from captured hostiles confirms the location of the control center, Stone reported in a voice devoid of emotion. Third sublevel, central chamber. Estimated 12 to 15 high-priority targets including the hive coordinator. They've been torturing captured coalition personnel for information about our capabilities. The way she said the word torturing made Zixtai's blood run cold. There was no anger or outrage in her voice, just a flat acknowledgement of fact that somehow suggested terrible consequences for the beings responsible. Morrison studied the tactical situation for several more minutes, his mind clearly working through possibilities and contingencies at superhuman speed. When he finally spoke, his plan was both brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. "We go in hard and fast," he said quietly. Walsh brings down the eastern section to draw their attention. Carter takes overwatch on the northern approach and eliminates their heavy weapons. Hayes infiltrates through the maintenance tunnels and secures the hostages. Stone and I take the direct route to the control center. "And me?" Zixtai asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Morrison looked at him with those cold blue eyes, and for a moment the human's expression seemed almost apologetic. "You stay here and coordinate with any surviving coalition forces. Someone needs to document what happens next." The assault began exactly as planned, which was to say it immediately devolved into controlled chaos that somehow achieved every objective. Walsh's explosives brought down a section of the hive complex with devastating precision, creating exactly the kind of distraction needed to draw defenders away from critical areas. The blast was so perfectly calculated that it eliminated dozens of enemies while leaving the structural integrity of their target areas intact. Carter's overwatch fire was methodical and deadly, each shot eliminating threats with mechanical efficiency. But Zixtai noticed that the human was no longer aiming just to disable or kill enemies. He was choosing his targets and shot placement to create maximum psychological impact on the surviving defenders. Hayes seemed to move through the complex, like smoke, appearing exactly where she was needed most and disappearing before enemy forces could respond. She not only rescued the captured coalition personnel, but also gathered additional intelligence and eliminated key defensive positions along the way. But it was Morrison and Stone who truly demonstrated what humans became when they stopped pretending to be civilized soldiers. Zixtai watched through his tactical scope as the two humans carved through the heart of the Keithmore stronghold like forces of nature. They didn't just fight their way to the control center. They systematically eliminated every single defender they encountered with cold efficiency. Morrison moved through enemy positions with fluid grace, adapting his tactics moment by moment to overcome each new obstacle. Stone followed behind him, ensuring that wounded enemies would never recover to fight again. When they finally reached the central control chamber, Zixtai witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The Keithmore hive coordinator, a massive creature that stood nearly 10 feet tall and commanded respect even from veteran Veltar warriors, attempted to surrender when faced with the two humans. Morrison shot it in the head without hesitation. The systematic destruction that followed was not random violence or battlefield fury. It was methodical elimination of every single piece of equipment, every data storage device, every communication system in the facility. The humans weren't just completing their mission, they were ensuring that the Keithmore slave operation would never recover or rebuild. When Stone discovered the torture chambers where coalition personnel had been held, her response was swift and final. Every Keithmore involved in the interrogations was eliminated, along with anyone who had been present or complicit in the activities. The entire assault lasted less than 2 hours from beginning to end. When it was over, the primary hive complex was a smoking ruin. Its defenders dead or scattered, its control systems completely destroyed. The Keithmore slave operation that had terrorized dozens of worlds for 50 years had been eliminated by 5 humans and their alien observer. As they prepared to evacuate, Zixtai found himself walking beside Morrison through the wreckage of what had been an impregnable fortress. The human captain was calmly checking his equipment and preparing status reports as if he had just completed a routine training exercise. "Captain," Zixtai said carefully, "what I witnessed today, your people fought with effectiveness that exceeded anything in my experience. But the methods," Morrison looked up at him with those cold blue eyes, and for just a moment, something human flickered in their depths. "We don't enjoy this, Commander, but when someone threatens innocent people, when they torture prisoners, when they turn entire populations into slaves, we become something else. We become what we need to be to stop them." As they reached the extraction point, Zixtai realized that he had learned something profound and terrifying about humanity. They weren't just another warrior species. They were something far more dangerous. Survivors who had turned their own capacity for adaptation and persistence into the most effective weapon the galaxy had ever seen. And the most frightening part was that they could turn it off again, becoming the friendly, polite beings he had first met. The medical bay aboard the rescue vessel hummed quietly as Zixtai lay on a treatment table, watching human medics tend to Coalition survivors. 5 days had passed since the extraction from Keithmore Prime, but his mind kept returning to what he had witnessed in those underground tunnels and the hive complex. The official mission reports would call it a complete success. The Keithmore slave operation had been destroyed, over 2 million beings had been freed, and the threat to peaceful civilizations had been eliminated. But the numbers told a different story about the cost of that victory. Of the 300 Coalition soldiers who had begun the assault, only 47 had survived. The Veltar had lost 60% of their forces. The Drachnian heavy weapons specialists had suffered 70% casualties. The Zentari stealth units had been almost completely wiped out, with only 3 survivors from their original 40-member force. The humans had lost 2 soldiers out of their original squad of 5. Zixtai found this statistical anomaly deeply disturbing, not because he doubted human courage or competence, but because he was beginning to understand that their survival rate was not based on luck or superior tactics. It was the result of something far more fundamental about what humans became when faced with extinction-level threats. Captain Morrison appeared in the medical bay doorway, looking almost exactly like the friendly professional officer who had introduced himself during their first meeting aboard the Nexus Prime. His uniform was clean and pressed. His blue eyes had returned to their normal calm expression, and he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone completing routine duties. "Commander, how are you feeling?" Morrison asked, with what seemed like genuine concern for Zixtai's injuries. "I will recover," Zixtai replied, studying the human captain carefully. "My people heal quickly from physical wounds." Morrison nodded and pulled up a chair beside the treatment table. "I wanted to thank you personally for your service during the mission. Your combat effectiveness and tactical expertise were instrumental in our success." Zixtai stared at this polite, seemingly ordinary human and felt a chill that had nothing to do with his injuries. This was the same being who had shot a surrendering enemy commander without hesitation, who had led his squad through impossible odds with cold efficiency, who had turned a desperate rescue mission into systematic extermination of everyone involved in the Keithmore slave operation. "Captain, I must ask you something," Zixtai said carefully. "During the assault, you and your people fought with capabilities that exceeded anything in my experience. Your tactical adaptations, your refusal to accept defeat, your willingness to continue fighting in situations where other species would have surrendered or died. How is this possible?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there during their casual conversation. "Commander, you've spent your entire military career fighting alongside species that have natural advantages. The Veltar are born warriors with enhanced strength and natural armor. The Drachnians have heavy weapons built into their physiology. The Zentari can become invisible at will. Every species in the Coalition has some special ability that makes them effective in specific combat roles." "Yes," Zixtai agreed. "Each species contributes their natural strengths to the collective defense. Humans don't have any of those advantages," Morrison continued. "We're not the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armed. We don't have natural weapons or enhanced senses or special abilities that make us obviously superior fighters. So we had to become something else. What did you become? Zixthai asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. Morrison looked out the medical bay window at the stars beyond, his expression distant. We became the species that doesn't give up, ever, no matter what the odds, no matter what the cost, no matter how hopeless the situation looks. Humans keep fighting until the threat is eliminated or we're all dead. It's not courage, exactly, and it's not stupidity. It's just what we are. But the methods I observed, Zixthai pressed, the systematic elimination of enemies, the refusal to accept surrender, the adaptation of captured technology. We're persistence hunters, Commander, Morrison said quietly. Back on Earth, before we developed technology, humans used to hunt prey by following them for days or weeks until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. We couldn't outrun them or overpower them, so we simply refused to stop chasing them until they died. That instinct never went away. When something threatens us or threatens innocent people under our protection, we hunt it until it's gone. Zixthai felt a deep unease settling in his chest. And when the threat is eliminated? Morrison turned back to him with a slight smile, and suddenly he looked like the friendly officer from their first meeting again. Then we go back to being the people who build hospitals and schools and try to help everyone get along peacefully. The other thing is just a tool we use when we have to. A soft chime announced the arrival of another visitor. Sergeant Hayes entered the medical bay, carrying a data pad and wearing the same polite expression she had shown during their initial introductions. Her blonde hair was neatly arranged, her uniform was regulation perfect, and her green eyes sparked with friendly warmth. Captain, sorry to interrupt, she said cheerfully. I have the final casualty reports and mission summaries for your review. Zixthai stared at this pleasant, professional woman and remembered watching her move through enemy positions like a hunting phantom, striking with deadly precision before vanishing into shadows. The transformation was so complete that he might have believed he had imagined the earlier version if not for the evidence in the mission records. How are the other survivors doing? Morrison asked Hayes. Most of the coalition personnel are responding well to treatment, she replied in the same warm, caring tone she might use to discuss a community charity project. Private Walsh has been helping with engineering repairs. Corporal Carter is assisting with tactical debriefings, and Medic Stone is working with the medical staff to treat the more seriously injured. All of them had returned to being the ordinary, helpful people they appeared to be at the beginning of the mission. But Zixthai now understood that their apparent normality was not a mask hiding their true nature. Both versions were equally real and equally human. Captain, Zixthai said slowly, I need to ask you directly, if circumstances required it, could your people fight against other coalition species with the same effectiveness you showed against the Keithmore? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Morrison and Hayes exchanged a brief glance that contained layers of communication Zixthai couldn't interpret. Commander, Morrison said finally, humans really don't want to fight anyone. We'd much rather build things and explore and learn about the universe alongside our allies. But if someone forced us into that situation, if they threatened Earth or attacked innocent civilians or tried to enslave populations under our protection. He paused, and for just a moment, those cold blue eyes flickered behind his friendly expression. Yes, we would hunt them until they stopped or until we were all dead. After the humans left, Zixthai lay alone in the medical bay, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he had learned. The galaxy was full of warrior species, predator races, and beings evolved for conflict. But humans were something different and infinitely more dangerous. They were survivors who had weaponized their own mortality, turned their emotional attachments into tactical advantages, and developed the ability to become whatever they needed to be to ensure their continued existence. The most terrifying part was their ability to switch between their normal civilized behavior and their hunting mode with no apparent psychological cost. They could be friendly diplomats and helpful allies right up until someone crossed a line they had drawn. And then they would become relentless predators who would not stop until the threat was completely eliminated. When Zixthai finally submitted his mission report to Veltar High Command, he included a personal recommendation that would change his career and possibly his entire species' relationship with humanity. He requested permanent assignment to human military units, not because he enjoyed fighting alongside them, but because he had realized a fundamental truth about galactic politics. The safest place in the universe during any conflict was on the same side as humanity, and the most dangerous place was anywhere else. His final entry in the mission log was brief, but profound. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the fastest, nor the most naturally gifted for warfare. But they are the only species I have encountered that treats extinction-level threats as engineering problems to be solved, rather than natural disasters to be endured. They do not fight until victory becomes impossible. They fight until victory becomes inevitable, or they are all dead. I recommend we never give them reason to consider the Veltar as anything other than trusted allies. As the rescue vessel prepared to jump back to Coalition space, Sixth Eye watched Captain Morrison and his surviving squad members through the observation deck windows. They were laughing together, sharing stories, and treating their wounded comrades with gentle care.